Well, welcome everybody to Fresh Black.Coffee. I'm David Van. Eddie's got some great, exciting things he's involved in today, and I'm actually flying solo on Eddie's pilot's chair. Eddie's going to tell you more about it when he comes back next week. So we at least, since we took off for the 4th of July, hope you guys had a great time. Independence Day, number 250, fantastic. It's also honoring the 200 years since we sadly lost two of the most prominent founding fathers. Same day, July 4th, we lost John Adams and the irreplaceable Thomas Jefferson. I remember John Kennedy when he was president, and he was beginning the initiative to do a manned space flight to the moon and back again. He invited all the top scientists, physicists, astronomers, everybody to the White House. And when they're all seated and began, he said, "Gentlemen," I think they were all guys, okay? He says, "Gentlemen, never before has so much intelligence assembled in the White House at any time since Thomas Jefferson dined alone." That's how much regard Kennedy had for Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was just a young man when he was asked to write the opening draft of the Declaration of Independence. And he was part of a committee, but Franklin and Adams said, "John, you write a draft and we'll start from there as a basis." They worked on it. He and Adams fought over a number of little piddly things just because that was their personalities. Later, everybody found out John Adams could be contentious. But anyway, then it was brought before the Continental Congress, all the delegates from the 13 colonies, cut and pasted, chopped and brutalized, and they eventually ended up with the document our kids study today. And so anyway, that's just a little bit of what was going on last week. We were commemorating, but since Eddie said, "Gosh, we don't want to miss 2 weeks in a row," so I said, okay, fine. I did have some guests I was trying to come in, but I didn't know Eddie would be gone until just a couple days ago, so I didn't, some things fell through. But anyway, what I want to do today, we're going to do a little bit different here, is we're going to do a news roundup. And it might not be quite as polished. All right, we'll just go with it. Let's see what's going on. The biggest thing, and I put it in the headlines of this episode podcast, is, what's happening with Mitch McConnell? And is there going to be an eminent seat open in the U.S. Senate for Kentucky's one of two assigned spots? And would Thomas Massie possibly grab that spot? I talked to a friend of mine last night, one of the top, most experienced campaign strategists in the country amongst Republican circles. And, I said, "What do you think?" This is a fellow that happens to know Thomas Massie. And he he was one of Ron Paul's top advisors. So he worked for Rand Paul, who's the other Kentucky U.S. Senator. And I think what he said, and he was very prudent, he said, you want to see what a person's made out of when they're no longer in power. Do they still passionately advocate for the same issues? And I said, "Oh, you're concerned he might become another Justin Amash." Justin Amash claimed to be a libertarian from Michigan, but was not a Trump fan. And the two went to war. And Justin Amash, when he left, he kind of went scorched earth. And a lot of people like me, my friend Jim Bridenstine served in Congress with both Massie and Amash, and a friend of mine went to Washington, D.C. to visit and was talking to her congressman. She worked for Bridenstine's campaign to get him elected. And so she pops by and said, hey, can we get a picture? And Bridenstine says, hang on a second, if you're not in a hurry. So he runs over to Amish's office and to Massie's office, says, hey, I got somebody who's really important. Help me get elected. Can you come pose her picture? So the three of them posed with her. Her name's Susan Lander. So she lives here in town, and I've gotten to know her from our active political efforts. So anyway, that's just how close those guys were. But you don't know if somebody really believes it or if it's just, what the campaign talking points are. If their handlers say, okay, here's what'll get you elected, advocate for this and this and be really passionate about that, And then you find out they're not necessarily from the heart believing it. In fact, I'll say I'm from a big Catholic family, okay? If you haven't figured that out by now, you probably are new to the podcast. And one of my cousins, my dad happened to work with a guy and eventually became a congressman from Minnesota, a Democrat. My dad was a big-time Democrat. Democrat Farmer Labor is a very grassroots little guy Democrat Party organization back then. Wasn't the socialist and communist organization it is today. But my dad was godfather to his nephew, the oldest of the next generation. And as graduation, guy says, well, what do you want to do? And he says, I'm really interested in politics. And he said, do you want to work on a campaign? I'll call Rick Nolan and, we'll see. And he worked Nolan's campaign, didn't win for Congress the first time, second time around, he won. And so fast forward, now that was back in the 70s, early 70s. Now, Rick Nolan eventually later in life, after leaving Congress for decades, goes back and became congressman for northeastern Minnesota, the Arrowhead region. And sure enough, my cousin says, hey, I'll come on board. He became legislative director for a Democrat at a time when the Democrats controlled Congress. So 2012, now I'm running Rick Santorum's presidential campaign in Oklahoma. I say I'm running, part of a big team, but they named me the campaign coordinator for Oklahoma. And it was a big organization, very grassroots. This was Tea Party days. And so my very leftist cousin and I are talking, and he's like, hey, your family, congratulations. I don't have the same philosophies as you, but I know it's a big thing in your life and you're my cousin. So we get to talking and he gives me some really important insights. And here's why I'm saying this. He said, now, he was a big supporter of Obama, and Obama's in office running for a second term, and Santorum wants to defeat Obama. Well, my cousin Jim says, Dave, there's only two Republicans running that us Democrats are afraid of. I said, really? He says, yeah, Romney we're not afraid of because we know he doesn't believe what he claims to be. You remember Romney called himself, severely conservative. Rush Limbaugh called him out. He says, nobody's really conservative ever uses the term severely conservative. You're treating it like it's some kind of plague, conservatism. The other one was Newt Gingrich. And, Newt is a mixed page. He's a great communicator. And boy, he's kind of like Pat Buchanan, can stir up the crowds. But Newt, you kind of wonder about. I mean, it was Newt's multiple affairs and lechery that brought his downfall. And he could be easily compromised. And Bill Clinton did and took him out, because of his own issues. Well, so back to what my cousin Jimmy is saying. He says, Dave, there's only two that we're really concerned about as Democrats. And he said, it's Ron Paul and Rick Santorum. I said, really? So why are they the two you're most, concerned about? He said, because they really believe what they're saying. The others don't. The others don't. See, there's a lot of people, a lot of politicos who are exploiting conservatism and fooling a lot of people. I'll tell you right now, Franklin, who's running, he's the top vote getter in the primary for superintendent of public instruction in Oklahoma. He is not at all a conservative by any metric I'm familiar with or use. In fact, we had Steve Bias here a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you listen to the guy and you're going to find out some things. He's probably more of an enemy to our conservative values than even Joy Hoffmeister was. And we found out we got snowed. And now we're getting snowed again. The majority of Republicans who voted, more Republicans who voted in that race voted for him over some of the others. I thought John Cox would have been great. Well, James Taylor, who's also a friend of mine, I've worked on his campaigns, helped him get started in politics. I've been to his house, been to his church, been to his schoolroom where he teaches. I know James, fantastic guy. He came in second, and I'm hoping we can get him in. I didn't have enough time to really work that out for this weekend. But this is the kind of thing. Oklahomans are getting snowed. And I, like a lot of people, have great reservations about the authenticity of what Gettner Drummond claims to be. My concerns about Gettner have more to do with temperament. I'm not quite there. And in some of his loyalties, some of his advocacies. So anyway, this is the thing, do they really believe what they're saying? And like my very liberal cousin, he's passed away since then, James Swiderski, he said, look, there's a lot of people that are leaders on the right in the Republican Party that we know they're not conservative at all. And a lot of times we just kind of plug our nose and pick, the least bad of our choices. And so we just got to organize on that. So Mitch McConnell, there's all kinds of reports, he's been hospitalized. They just, are pictures of him getting loaded into an ambulance. There's some rumors he might be brain dead. Now this morning I'm seeing, they're saying they don't think he is, but clearly he's struggling. So let's just take a look at here. Mitch McConnell is not wearing an oxygen mask when loaded in the ambulance. Rumors of brain dead are likely false. In other words, they would have likely put an oxygen mask on him if it had been that severe. Now, Scott Jennings, who's a very effective communicator on CNN for conservative advocacy, says that Mitch called him next morning after he'd been hospitalized, and had an incident, and they talked. But, Scott kind of didn't press him. Scott was kind of putting his press hat, throwing it in the back seat and just talking to Mitch as a friend. And just, I think now Scott would probably, if he's being honest, in what he says, he's probably wishing he had pressed him a little more on, okay, tell me, what is the big health concern? I mean, because I do that. I got friends, they're calling me from the hospital, and, I'm heard, man, they got hauled in hands. The first thing I'm going to say is, Bill, tell me how to pray. What is the biggest medical need? Where do you need God's help in intervening? Because I'm a man of faith, okay? And that, so I want to know, what is the biggest issue, the hurdle that we've got to overcome? So there's that. Now, my friend Kirk Shelley who, worked on the Ron Paul campaigns and also worked Rand Paul's presidential run. And I got to know him over time. He called me last night. We just, had been texting and that. And he said, when somebody all of a sudden is out of power, sometimes they'll show their true colors and you're kind of ashamed, did I support that? And so he said, I'm watching Massie. And I, and Kirk is somebody that he doesn't want to be a politician's friend because he knows it's going to compromise him. And he's very tough about holding all politicians accountable, even the ones whose campaigns he works on. So, recently we've seen Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's kind of going scorched earth on a lot of things. And you're like, wow, what the heck's going on? So that's going on. If Massie, who really is liked by the people of Kentucky, if he stays true to who he is and, doesn't go scorched earth, it is a possibility. But I told Kirk, I said, hey, listen, I thought he was incredibly popular in his own district. And then a bunch of, pro-Israel PAC money took him out. And I told Kirk, I said, look, I've been a pretty big supporter of the Trump agenda. But when Trump went after Massie the way he did, I thought it was way over the top. And I'm just absolutely disgusted with what Trump did to Massie. I mean, calling him the worst congressman ever in the history of the United States. Thomas Massie. I'm sorry, Trump, but, you're in the 2% who believe that. The rest of us know that's not true. I mean, really? George Santos was a better congressman than Thomas Massie? Really? More principled? Really? So anyway, so we've got that going on. That's kind of a hour by hour news story today. So I wanted to keep you up on that. Let's see. There are some other things happening. We pretty much everybody's sick of the whole Candace Owens, craziness. I mean, she's just looking like clickbait material. She just kind of whatever can get her views. It seems to be all about the money. So, in fact, this morning I went to Babylon Bee, just for a little humor relief. And they had some classic things to say about Candace Owens. Let me just pull it up here and tell you. Candace Owens confirmed to be a Jewish plot to make anti-Semites look retarded. It's just because she is looking bad. And yeah, she's kind of getting on the anti-Israel kick. And we'll see that. By the way, since we're at Babylon Bee, I just want to say, there's a few that I just thought were classic. Embattled Nazi politician Plattner is the latest Nazi to flee to Argentina, but Argentina doesn't want him. So you almost have to be a boomer or beyond to understand that. It was after World War II, a lot of the Nazi leaders fled to Argentina to escape, the Nuremberg trials. So let's see. I've got a little bit of a deep dive here on an issue. As you know, all over the country, governments and zoning authorities and politicians, utility board members and stuff are all, trying to okay, what's the policy we're going to have about these data centers? Now, why data centers? Now, here in central or eastern Oklahoma, we're a little bit ahead of the game because just outside of Pryor, Oklahoma, in the Mid-America Industrial Park, lies one of the biggest data centers probably in the world, okay, are up there, okay, and is put in by Google. Google went there for two things. Now, I have close friends to the Industrial Park Board, former banker, vice president of a bank in that area, and his banking partner served on the Mid-America Industrial Park Board. And he said, there's two reasons Google came. Well, there's probably more than that, but the two biggest reasons. Number one, Grand River Dam Authority, which is a state government trust authority. It was put in, you have to go back to the Great Depression days. And we were trying to mitigate flooding risks because, the heavens can open up and deluge us, and flooding is crazy. And Grand River, would flood massively. So they put a dam in, the Pensacola Dam. And this is not far from Pryor. And then, backed it up upstream. It created a massive lake called the Grand Lake of the Cherokees. We just call it Grand Lake. And, hey, why don't we make that a hydroelectric generating dam and make a little money off of it? So they did, and the Corporation Commission, assigned them a territory. That's kind of how we do with our regulated monopolies in utilities is, all right, PSO, this is your market. Oklahoma Gas and Electric, this is your market. Grand River Dam Authority, you get this, and they just carve up the state. And you and I, as consumers, it's dictated to us who our supplier is, because they're not going to allow, 6 different companies to have 6 different independent grids of, power poles going across our backyard. Who wants to see that? It'd just be a tangled mess. So instead of the natural competition, keeping the price low, we put a government agency called the Corporation Commission in charge of, they have to approve their rates. So Grand River Dam Authority, being an Oklahoma government or pseudo-government trust, they don't pay taxes. There's a lot they don't pay. They don't have shareholders, stockholders, people who own shares of the company and don't pay out dividends and stuff. So they're able to operate at a profit at a much lower cost to their consumers. And that's why if you live up in that part of the state, your electric bill is quite a bit lower than it is, say, here where I'm in Tulsa, Public Service Company of Oklahoma, which is part of AEP, Oklahoma Gas Electric being another, and there are others. But so Google went in to that, Mid-America Industrial Park, and you can see the smokestack of the generating plant. Now, they started out, Grand River Dam Authority start with hydroelectric, but like any entity, they just kept wanting to grow and build, and then they needed more. And then, the energy needs got more. Well, now they started natural gas power plants. Someplace they may have coal, or they'll call it clean coal, of course, which is just a talking point. But they have cleaned it up quite a bit. And then they even have, wind generating field, these big windmills across the fruited plain out in central and western Oklahoma. They have that. And so they were able to get electricity, which is the biggest expense of a data center. The power that's required is massive. Now for Google, I saw they put in just kind of a prototype server building. Actually, I think they used an existing building when they bought up more than a square mile of property up there. They all did it in secret. I mean, it was, crazy. And even while they were building this out, their contractors were not allowed to say they worked for Google. They just said, I work for a contractor in the industrial park, you know. Anyway, then they kept building and building, and I saw substation after substation after substation. Now, why am I saying? I literally, for about 20 years, maintained a building for a client of mine who was just maybe, you know, quarter mile away from the Google facility. So I watched all this happening, and the jobs, oh my God, the contractors, you know, when the shift change happened around 4:00, hundreds of cars, pickup trucks going in and out of there. Prior benefited greatly. One of the things, you know, because Google does pay taxes, including property taxes, the appraised value of that plant, that installation, that data center was just so high that the county's collecting property taxes like unbelievably high. In fact, the portion of county property tax that went to schools generated so much money that the prior school district was told by the state, you don't get any state aid because you're already getting way more than what our schedules say that we've got to guarantee everybody to come up to. You already get that. Now, Pryor's not the only one. Actually, at the time I researched this about 8 years ago, there was, I think, 36 school districts in Oklahoma that were so wealthy, they got no state aid. Other areas of state, you know, the state legislatures having to fund half or more of the cost of running your school district. So the others are largely where there's, you know, windmill farms, solar farms, things like that, because the appraised value is so high. And they're using what used to be cattle grazing land, you know. So we had things like that. So the data centers, you see all kinds of issues. And what I've been saying about the ones coming in the Tulsa area, and I think there's probably 5 or so that have been talked about, different areas. I've watched them largely be in areas where they could, if the state allowed, pull off of a Grand River Dam Authority high voltage power line going right over their property. That includes North Tulsa. There's one that the county had to, county commissioners had to intervene and make a decision on. And then East Tulsa, which is where it's rumored Meta or Facebook was wanting to put one in. Another area of the United States that really surprises me how much data centers are going in there is, I'll call it a little town called Cheyenne, Wyoming. Cheyenne is the state capital city of Wyoming, but they only have maybe 50,000 people in that metro. I call it, it's not even a metro area, but it's not a large city at all. I have a brother that lives up there in Cheyenne. He's lived there for, 30 some years, maybe 40 years. And I called him last night because I saw, you know, one of my news sources I go to a lot is Cowboy State News and Cowboy State Daily, which is an online news service largely serving Wyoming. And they said that Facebook is really under the gun, actually, from the lone congresswoman from Wyoming, because they've corrupted and polluted the water treatment system, the wastewater treatment system for the city of Cheyenne. Well, they were told back in March, hey, don't dump your wastewater into our city. You guys have to handle it yourself. And so they had their own on-site wastewater treatment system. Now, why do they need water out there? Largely, it's the coolers. Okay. If you've been up to Mid-America Industrial Park, it'll surprise you, these monstrous towers with steam coming from them. The supercomputers that places like Google use and stuff involve so much energy and generate so much byproduct of heat that in order for them not to catch fire and just fry, they have to be cooled down extensively. And the reason Cheyenne, Wyoming became a really good site for it is, alternative energies are in abundance there. They have windmills across the fruited plain. My brother doesn't like it. He says, I'm sorry, it's not pretty anymore. It's all ugly. I love the mountains. I moved out here because of the view, and now all I see is these white flickering, pinwheels. And it is so windy in Wyoming. I mean, you think Oklahoma's got wind, go to Wyoming, okay? The Chinook winds are far more powerful. In fact, twice this year, I saw it in the news and asked my brother last night about it. I said, geez, I saw where a train, literally the whole train, like over half mile of boxcars, all got blown over on their side and knocked off the tracks. I saw that, he says, yeah, it's happened twice this year. He says, that's the thing. We get so much wind, especially in the spring. Well, when you've got that kind of wind, you can generate a lot of electricity. You can harness it. And the windmills, if you're going to put them in, that's one of the places you put them. And then you got, here's another dynamic. He said, we're higher altitude and we're dry climate. He said, when you're using water coolers, essentially, to cool down these supercomputers, if it's humid out, if the air is heavy with moisture, it doesn't cool as effectively. But when you got that dew point so low and it's so dry that that water coming down, as it evaporates, it drops the ambient temperature around it to dew point. Well, the dew point is much lower in Wyoming relative to the air temperature. And so it is a lot more effective. So it does make a high altitude arid environment ideal for this kind of thing. Now, I don't know what their energy grid is, but now, what do you do with this water? Well, you want to keep recycling it, reclaiming it and stuff, but the problem is you heat up that water. Now bacteria will grow. And Giardia was one of the things that got into the waste treatment system of the city. The interesting thing about it that I think we're being told a bunch of garbage from the city council up there in Cheyenne, and including their congresswoman, is they're acting like it's sabotage of a waste treatment system that Giardia got into it. My brother, who actually happens to have run his own environmental waste disposal company, he was EPA, federally certified. Boeing actually trained him to do this when he worked for Boeing out in Washington. And then he moved back to Wyoming, started his own company, sold it for 7-figure sum to an oil company. The oil companies, when they got horizontal drilling and fracking and all that into the shale oil they were able to get, they pump up a lot of salt water, and you got to do something with it. And unlike Oklahoma, where we have the Arbuckle Dome, that is ideal for pumping that salt water back down in it so it doesn't get into our aquifer, they don't have that. So they had to I'm getting a lot off of the track here. My brother is involved in that, and he's very intelligent. He's written 2 books on minerals and recovery and treatment systems and stuff. So my brother says, really, this is sabotage when bacteria is found in your sewer system? you know, he said, I think the city has been taking shortcuts and kind of got overwhelmed, and they're looking for a bad guy to say, oh, they did something improper. I'm sorry, but if bacteria gets in the sewer line, yeah, that's where it grows. And Giardia, which is one of the more prominent ones. Now, they say that because that's one of those things that can really affect your health. Okay, you go swim in a lake, you're risking Giardia, because if any of that lake water gets ingested, gets in your mouth, in your nose, or anything, yeah, you can get sick from it. So that's what's going on there. And he told me, he said, look, Cheyenne right now has either permitted or built 14 data centers. Now think about it, 14 in a metro area of less than 60,000 residents. That's overwhelming. So I don't know what's going to happen there. Now, why is this push for data centers? Well, we've reached a critical mass on internet computing. Remember search engines? Gosh, I remember all the different ones. AOL had a search engine. Netscape had a search engine. Alta Vista. I remember when it came, oh, this is cool. And then Google. Google kind of became the big player. And then everybody had to write their website coding for what's called search engine optimization, which basically meant do it the way Google wants you to do it, because that's the search engine everybody uses. I mean, nobody says, hey, DuckDuckGo it, or Alta Vista it, or Yahoo it. No, they say Google it. Okay. So, in what it would do, you type in a phrase and it's going to kick back a list of websites that most prominently that phrase is found in. It might not have anything to do with what you're searching for. And you would have to click through and click through and click through and try to get an answer to the question you have. Now, the supercomputers have basically read the whole internet and stored it all, cross-referenced it, tagged, labeled, everything, so that you can ask a search engine a question. It does all of the clicking through, and then it gives you an answer. So, in fact, why don't I just try doing it now for you? Let's see. I've got on my phone, I decided to load X.com, formerly Twitter. They had their own AI called Grok. And I actually trust Grok better than I trust Google's Genesis one. And let's just try a search and see what happens here. Let me turn off Bluetooth on my phone. Now, what is the status of Mitch McConnell's health as of this morning?
He's still in the hospital, recovering from a medical emergency on June 14th. His office says he's improving and working with staff, but they've given almost no details on what happened or his exact condition. He was taken from his home unconscious. Reports mention possible cardiac arrest and CPR, and has been there nearly a month now. No public appearances or direct statements from him since then, which has sparked a lot of speculation, including unconfirmed death rumors on X that his team and allies like Scott Jennings have pushed back on. Kentucky's governor and others are calling for more transparency, especially with the Senate back in session. Bottom line, official word is he's alive and getting better, but the lack of info has everyone guessing.
All right. I'm sorry if you didn't hear that as well. I should have. I'm trying to figure out how close you have the phone speaker to this microphone. Grok read 27 pages after I asked that question. And then in their own words, the computer gave us a summation of 27 different web pages, all in less than 3 seconds. Now, yes, it took longer than 3 seconds for it to read, but it wrote it after studying, and in 3 seconds. So now you see the power of AI. Now, that's just one facet of it. A couple months ago, we had a prominent district court judge for Oklahoma, Bill LaFortune. Bill's a former mayor and from a very prominent and esteemed family in Oklahoma. And I asked Bill, who's an attorney himself. He actually had been, district attorney, worked in the attorney general's office and stuff. So I asked Bill, I said, I was reading a report. A Chicago headquartered big law firm announced they are firing 1,000 employees, over 1,000, and replacing them with AI. And I said, Judge, I didn't even know a law firm would have 1,000 employees. And he says, oh, yeah, this is a big global one. They are a big monster with offices all over the world. That's who we're talking about here. Okay, that helps me understand. And he said, yeah, he says the way justice is prepared and presented in courts is going to greatly be affected by AI. And I mean, I know a number of attorneys who've been guests on the show have said, oh, yeah, I use AI now all the time to do my legal research. Now, you don't just accept everything AI tells you, because it might reference a case and said, here's what we learned from this case. You go to that and no, that case wasn't about that. And so you got to make sure that when they reference something, you get those references accurate. Because if an opposing counsel decides to challenge you, they could totally discredit you and might even get you sanctioned for perjury as an officer of the court. So this is kind of what AI can do. And anybody doing any research, I mean, not only will this allow a college student in their doctoral thesis to do all the research for their thesis in less than 20 minutes, but it'll literally write the thesis for you. And you can even tweak what kind of writing style you want it to do. You can show it a picture of you holding this little largemouth bass you caught at the lake last weekend. And you say, hey, AI, make that a 300-pound bass I'm holding in my hands. And now all of a sudden it takes your same picture, which is a very high quality of you doing, this and, straining to hold it up. And it can be very believable. In right now, the Oklahoma Ethics Commission, which is way more powerful than they should be and unaccountable, they are proposing rules on politicians about the use of AI because they can make an ad so believable. They can literally make a video of a campaign candidate's opponent giving a speech where they're saying the most blasphemous and treasonous things. And unless they, put a disclaimer that this is an AI, fabrication, a lot of people won't know. A lot of people won't know. So these are the things where AI is going to change our society in the coming months. And it already has. It already has. Okay. But we're going to see it more and more. People are right now. I mean, what I just did is free on Grok. But if I keep talking to Grok, and you can have a communication with Grok, you got a conversation, and Grok will talk to you, and you'll think it's a person. Some people might become so emotionally attached to their companion on the phone, which is Grok, or on their laptop or whatever, that they can become so delusional in thinking that's a real human being. So now clearly it's more in the platonic sense because, you don't go fishing together at the lake because AI doesn't drop a line in the water with you. Maybe on the screen, I don't know. I mean, people may want to live the fantasies. I don't know. There's a lot of perverted things I won't go into where AI could change everything. But right now, they're trying to get people hooked on it, and then they're going to start charging for it. And I was telling a friend of mine last night, I said, eventually our AI subscription might cost us more than our cable TV subscription does now. And there's a lot of people just not going to do that. And they'll push us as far as they can. But this is going to cost a lot of money. And people are going to want a return on their investment. So we'll see what goes on with that. But so these are some of the dynamics changing things, and we've got to see what goes on with that. Let's just talk a little bit about what's going on politically. I've got some announcements for you. In the next few weeks, we are going to have both runoff candidates for state insurance commissioner. Now, is that the most pressing race that we have to decide? No. But I'm sitting here in the studios of Fresh Black Coffee from the office of Eddie Huff Insurance. Eddie's been an insurance guy all his life. He understands it. He knows what an insurance agent needs from our state and policy making, and he knows what his clients are counting on and that. So, and he knows there are problems that need to be fixed. And so he's going to really drill down on that more so than me. That's kind of Eddie's forte. So we've got Bob Sullivan coming in. He's been in here a few weeks ago, but Marty is going to be next up. Marty Quinn from Claremore. Both these guys are, from Green Country, Northeast Oklahoma. I'm hoping to get maybe Kevin West in, who's running for labor commissioner, I think it is. Yeah. No. Maybe. Anyway, we've got a labor commissioner race. What else have we got? Lieutenant governor's decided. Of course, governor. We've decided AG on the Republican side. Mike Mazzei claims to have a 44 to 36% polling lead over Gentner Drummond. Been talking to a lot of people. They feel that Gentner's policies and his personality make him very much like those of us who are old-time Okies know Vince Orza. Vince was a candidate in 1990 on the Republican primary for governor. He was a TV news anchor in the Oklahoma City market, and he also owned a chain of restaurants that became pretty popular. Garfield's is the name of it. And they had restaurants all over the state. But Vince won the primary. I mean, very charismatic, hard-charging, very opinionated. You either love him or hate him. Kind of that dynamic of Donald Trump, but probably not as successful because he won the primary, but he had a ceiling of support. He lost the runoff. Burns Hargis lost out in the primary, but Bill Price, a former federal prosecutor who put a lot of the corrupt county commissioners in the state in jail or thrown out of office or plea bargained away, to where they saved themselves going to prison. But about a third of our county commissioners in the state of Oklahoma, out of 200 and some, at least a third of them had felony convictions in the 80s. Frank Keating, Bill Price, and Gary Richardson were largely responsible for that as Reagan's prosecutorial team. So Bill Price, became the consensus candidate and went up against David Walters, who, of course, should have been convicted of felony. He got his friend, a fellow Democrat, district attorney in Oklahoma City, Bob Massie, to plea bargain down to misdemeanor so he wouldn't get thrown out of office. But that's how corrupt Oklahoma can be. And then Vince Orsa, 12 years later, decides to run for governor again. But this time, he's not a Republican. Why, he's a Democrat. In fact, he was so popular that in the Democrat primary, 2002, he got the most votes on the Democrat side, coming from the Republican Party to prove to the Democrats, I'm one of you, and he got the most votes. Brad Henry came in second. Brad Henry won the runoff. Why? Because Vince Orsa has a ceiling of support. There's a big dislike factor with Vince Orsa, or at least in those two races there were. And I use that as an example to say, I think some of that applies in the Gettner-Drummond situation. And a lot of it is just how he presents himself, the fights he picks, the just kind of abrasive, sometimes hostile way in which he goes after politically. He picks fights I don't think he needs to pick. And so Mike Mazzei, on contrast, starts looking a lot better. And I'm pretty impressed with Mike. When he was in here a year ago, I don't think I gave him a 2% chance of getting this far. And he's really impressed me on that. So that's going on. The only change in our DC delegation, we are not voting for either of our U.S. Senate offices. This is the off election. The next two even numbered years, we will, be voting on those races. So actually, no, we are voting on U.S. Senate, but Kevin Hearn has got it. And that's a special election, okay, because Mark Wayne Mullen resigned his Senate seat that he'd previously won so that he could take a post in the Trump administration. That opened up first district. The interesting thing is, and, Eddie and I knew Mark Tedford before this, thought quite highly of him, and we both supported him. Tedford's in that race, and there's a whole bunch of other people. One of the rumors I heard early on was, hey, there's a guy that if he does run, he's going to win it. And this is from a political figure I have considerable respect for. Just a second. So somebody said, if Dan Rooney runs, I think he's going to win. Why? And he said, one, decorated military hero, fighter pilot, officer, started an organization to help some of his friends and other families who suffered losses. And that organization is called Folds of Honor, which is a big national organization now and raises a ton of money. And Dan is now quite wealthy. The one thing I looked into it that kind of became the uncomfortable issue, I think, for Dan is that he started this organization, serves as the head of the organization, and his board approved quite a pay package for him. Somewhere in the $500,000 a year salary range. And when you're running for office and, you're asking people of limited means to donate money, and your CEO, your founder, is sucking off $500,000 a year for his own, that can be bad optics. So he faced that I mean, Dan's a very likable guy. I'm just telling you, he is, okay? And you have to admire a lot about Dan, all right? But the other issue is Jackson Lawmeyer, who this is his second run for public office. He's employed Roger Stone on his campaign staff. Roger Stone, who has a long-standing relationship with Donald Trump, Roger kind of became an influence peddler and still very much is. And Roger makes a lot of money. I mean, the last time Jackson Lawmeyer ran U.S. Senate, his campaign consultants called me when they decided to drop Jackson as a client. And he said, look, his people just decided without us to pay Roger Stone, I think it was like $20,000 a month, under the promise from Roger that I'll raise $100,000 in campaign funds for you. And I don't know if he ever delivered on that. But this time around, Jackson employs Roger Stone again. And what do you know? Roger Stone, it looks like he delivered, because Trump, of all of the great candidates, Trump decided to endorse Jackson Lawmeyer. And then we find out Jackson Lawmeyer has some inconvenient history. And sadly, Jackson Lawmeyer, who made it in the runoff, still did not win the plurality in the primary. Mark Tedford still did, but that was somewhat because in the last few days before Election Day, some moral failures were, reported on. The Daily Mail carried it. I know some of the people involved in uncovering it, in some of the people who were offered the story to run, who have media outlets. Anyway, now I'm thinking, if you're Dan Rooney, you're kind of like, man, maybe I should have stayed in the race. But I think Dan Rooney values his Folds of Honor organization more than his personal political career. And I think he decided to prioritize that. And in the nature of politics, it can get dirty. And I'm sure there are people who would have exploited his personal salary that he's sucking off of that fundraising, because it is a lot of money. And it just doesn't look good when you're, skimming that much off. And yeah, you could say, well, my board approved it. Yeah, but you're the one who picked your board, probably. I don't know. That's how these things work. So Tedford, as a result of the number 2 finisher dropping out, now they're not going to do a runoff. Tedford just is declared the Republican nominee. So that moves on to December. So that's it for deciding the Democrat nominees for the November election in Oklahoma. And it looks like we're probably going to sweep everything. All the statewide offices and all of the DC delegation offices will stay right where it's at. The growing concern we have in Oklahoma is the resurgence of a very urban socialist Democrat Party. And they've decided, to abandon rural Oklahoma and just become, the leftist socialist party that is in 2 counties, Oklahoma County and Tulsa County. So the Oklahoma City metro area and the Tulsa metro area. And in the legislature, they largely dominate those offices. All of the state legislative offices that are the districts are completely within Tulsa or completely within Oklahoma City. I think just about all of them now are Democrat held. And that's changed in the last 10 years. A lot of Republicans were holding those seats and now are not. Part of it is a lot of conservatives are just done with urban life and are moving to the suburbs. And the chances of us getting a conservative mayor in Tulsa, are becoming slimmer and slimmer. So that's going on. And I think the next couple of weeks or a few weeks, you look for us to have some candidates in on that. We'd like to get some more. And, the offer's open. If you're on the ballot in August, contact us. We'll get you in. Let's take a look at what's going on in the election. Let's see. Grants dismissal of a Proud Boys case. A Trump judge just grants dismissal of a Proud Boys case. Now, I don't know if this was a criminal case against Proud Boys. Okay, yeah. So the Trump Justice Department said, okay, let's quit doing lawfare against the Proud Boys. And I think they have been doing a lot of that. Let's see. We got a few other things. And Corey Lewandowski. Right now is they're looking at a federal investigation. Let's just look at this as a big picture thing. Kristi Noem was selected to head Homeland Security, a very powerful and very important cabinet post. Homeland Security handles just that, all of the, now FBI still is under the Justice Department in that, but emergency management, if there's a hurricane coming, if there's another 9/11, planes, flying into the trade towers or into the Pentagon, that kind of response, Homeland Security coordinates all of it. Secret Service is under Homeland Security. So the former governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem's very interesting. She's a farm girl. I say farm girl. She's a woman, but very gorgeous, very pretty, especially given her age, attractive. And so she's head of Homeland Security. A number of things just are not adding up. A number of things just kind of looking like maybe her personal life has some instability. And she announces her resignation, that she's going to leave sometime in June. Now, our friend Mark Wayne Mullen, I remember just a few years ago, he sat in that chair with Eddie to come in the studio for a podcast. Mark Wayne, Cherokee boy, he grew up on a ranch that his family's had for a long time. His dad was a plumber, took over the plumbing business when his dad died, turned it into a huge empire, the biggest plumbing, heating, air conditioning, a whole bunch of stuff, electrical, turned it into a massive thing and made millions. Very, very successful. Yeah, he could write books on how to do it. And then, moves into politics. Yes, he had his other hobbies, a little bit of MMA stuff, loved wrestling, Anyway, Mark Wayne Mullen, who's, quite an Oklahoma character, gets tapped by Trump to take over. And he's looking good. He really is looking good. I think Oklahoma can be proud of one of their sons, filling this role. And I think the Cherokee tribe, if they're honest, they ought to be proud about it because he's representing the Cherokees and all of the tribes of Oklahoma very well. A former congressman, a former U.S. senator, and now, one of the top cabinet appointees. So what's happening with Mark Wayne Mullen and, his people at Homeland Security are starting to uncover some things. I say, hey, our predecessor doesn't look like they ran a clean ship here. Kristi Noem said, well, I'm resigning because my husband's, health, I think it was cancer, she said, all that. And I've got to spend more time with him. Well, it just announced today she's divorcing her husband. Really, You're quitting your top government job to devote yourself to your husband and care for him. And just weeks later, you're saying, yeah, I'm divorcing him. And evidently, there's some reports of different kind of sex kinks that her husband's been involved in. Well, there's been rumors of sex kinks that Christie's been involved in. And one of the people that got the boot out of Homeland Security, I mean, she says she resigned, but everybody in Washington knows she got fired. Trump got rid of her, okay? But he got rid of Corey Lewandowski, who was his campaign manager in 2015, 2016. And now Corey Lewandowski is under investigation for improper influence in how certain contracts are awarded. I'm getting this from Citizen Free Press, which is my go-to. I mean, decades ago, I'd go to the Drudge Report every morning. It's kind of that aggregate headline feed thing. Citizen Free Press is where you want to go. Do not waste your time on Drudge Report. And so they're reporting on this. So, the soap operas never end, do they? So on either side. So get ready for that to happen. I do want to talk about the Charlie Kirk assassination hearing. Now, interesting, this is called a pretrial hearing. This serves a purpose. You can go one of two tracks. If you're the prosecutor and you have somebody indicted, it can happen. Just because you press charges, you don't bring them to trial. The judge either orders the trial or doesn't. A prosecutor can do that, or a prosecutor might call for a grand jury. When a grand jury happens, it's oftentimes quite secretive, and a jury ultimately decides if something goes to trial. And in that scenario, defense, the people under investigation largely aren't even allowed to sit in the room. And they certainly don't get to present defense arguments or present their own witnesses that might clearly explain away, give a good answer. Like, no, there wasn't any, here's why I did it. And this person is vouching, put them on the stand. Yeah, they did because this, and then they can look to a paper trail. And, well, what do you know? Yeah, that seems legit. And a judge might say, there's no case here. Certainly it isn't beyond reasonable doubt. There's clearly reasonable doubt whether or not this was criminal. So grand jury, a lot of times you'll get somebody, bound over for trial that really should not be. Now, this kind of situation where the prosecutor presented it to the courts, the warrant for arrest and everything. Then you had arraignment. You have all these processes. And then this is where now what happened this week is prosecution says, okay, judge, here in open court, these are the exhibits. This is the evidence why we think a crime was committed by this person sitting here. And in that situation, the defendant can have his own attorney there, and his own attorney can say, okay, we'd like to answer a few of these things to give the court better clarity, on it. So the defendant has a little bit more opportunity to have a case thrown out before it ever gets litigated. What happened with Tyler Robinson is that event happened this week, that hearing. And I'm telling you, it looks like a slam dunk conviction. This guy grew up in a what looks like a very conservative and very impressive home life. And despite all that, as a young man, he's kind of going off the kink rail, and he's got a boyfriend who appears to have been quite sexually active with, but this boyfriend is described as a furry, okay? That means it's different than a transgender where they think, yeah, I've got a full beard, but I think I'm a woman. No. They put these little, bunny ears on and a cottontail sticking out of their butt, and they say, I think I'm a bunny. And it's at times can get delusional, and you have to wonder, are they even mentally sane and stable? But that's what furries are. And so what's going on here is Tyler's boyfriend, the furry, takes the stand and becomes witness for the prosecution. And yeah, pretty much without anything else, that testimony, along with the text messages, hands a phone over, says, we were texting about it right after, he says, yeah, I shot and killed him. And here's where the gun is. And, the phone call, all the different communications are going on. And they literally have step by step how the crime in the cover up and everything. And Tyler, you have to say, this guy, he drank the media's Kool-Aid. And the far left's derangement syndrome that, claim Charlie Kirk is this animal, I think Tyler Robinson is incredibly regretting. Even the day after he shot and killed him, he said to his boyfriend, I wish I hadn't done that. So, anyway, now what does this do for Candace Owens and all of her conspiracy theories? I don't care. Candace doesn't need facts. She makes up her own, okay? So, and she does it for clicks. And I'm telling you, folks, try not to enrich her, all right? If she just does the sensational things to drive traffic and that, I get it. You want to find out for yourself. I understand. And I commend you. Not just taking somebody else's word for the character of a person, because that's how Charlie Kirk got killed. But try not to enrich the purveyors of this irresponsibility like Candace Owens, in my opinion, is doing. So that's what's going on there. There is a growing body of evidence. If you remember, about 3 years ago, a pretty famous case of a Christian school in the Nashville area where a graduate of that school decided to do the whole transgender thing. Happened to be in high school, a young girl who after high school decides to start taking massive testosterone treatments and stuff and transitioning to a guy. And what do you know? A violent event occurred, shot and killed a bunch of people. And the media, again, any major city in the United States, you have to assume the media is a liar. You have to assume that. There may be exceptions. I get that. And they will prove out. But for your own sake, assume the media is lying to you. I'm talking TV, radio, and especially television. They're lying to you. They are part of the cover-up. So what happens is, and even, the police department stuff, there was a manifesto, and it was put under seal. And finally, somebody leaked it and got punished for leaking it. But that manifesto said exactly what a bunch of us on the right thought it said. that this is politically motivated and it was mass murder, terrorism with a political agenda, period. And it's happening all over the United States. And now the socialists and communists, which control the Democrat Party, are in open sedition against the United States. They are in open sedition against the United States. And likely any county Democrat convention you go to in a major city in the United States, there will probably be active sedition conspiring going on. There's very likely. So, yeah, they're taking over, okay? Treat it as an invasion, hostile enemy of the state. So what's going on now is you've got this young girl wanting to transition to be a guy, irresponsibly being pumped up with massive doses of testosterone in many cases. I'm telling you, the organ in the body most affected by hormone treatments is the brain. The brain. What is it the feminist radical left talks about, bashing men? They call it toxic masculinity. Toxic testosterone. There's too much testosterone. They blame the violence in America on violent men and violent testosterone. And it's literally a way of making boys in public schools feel like second-class citizens, hopelessly corrupt and, constantly having to apologize for having an Adam's apple. Okay? But really what's going on here, I mean, I'm telling you, it plays such a powerful role in our mental health. Libido is affected by hormones. Aggressiveness affected by hormones. Sadness. I mean, think about it. When a woman has a baby, there is a significantly high risk of depression. It's even called postpartum depression. Not that her hormones go off the charts. It's a very natural process. Certain hormones drop by a factor of 10. In other words, a woman who's pregnant, her estrogen could reach about 4,300 parts per million. I don't know. I just looked at some numbers recently and got some comparison. They say, yeah, normally in childbearing years, a woman might be estrogen at 240 or so, but they can go up to 4,300. And postmenopausal, it's likely to be below 50. Okay, so you see what happens is factor of 10 from menopausal, childbearing years, you're 10 times estrogen. Pregnancy, you're 10 times, 20 times that. So that radical change, guess what it does? It can be vulnerable to. It doesn't mess her uterus up, doesn't mess up her cervix or any of those organs, messes her brain up. And she can go into depression. It's a very real thing because your brain is very affected by hormones. These crazy transgender treatments that are very, very suspect are unnaturally trying to change a woman's brain into a man's brain. And they're having terrible, terrible results. And people are dying. And I don't mean the people who take those hormone treatments, the people they mass murder. Okay? So, and I said that 3 years ago. Now, I happen to be particularly well-trained on some mental health thing. I don't have initials after my name. It's not like I've got board licensing. But the most prominent mental health advocacy organization in the nation, NAMI, trained me to do a number of things. And then I got more training so that law enforcement, brings me in to train their people. Legislature brings me in to update state law and state policy. And I teach families who have a loved one in crisis. In fact, I was just dealing with a prominent family situation last night. And I cannot say I have to be, but it's people that many of you have heard of in the news, especially in Oklahoma. And sometimes things don't make sense until you understand the mental health component that is often not talked about so as to protect the health privacy of people. And once you understand that, we had District Attorney Steve Kunzweiler in. Steve has great insight on this because his own daughter suffered greatly from mental health challenges. So much so that she ended up having to stand trial on charges of attempting to kill her own father. And Steve was severely injured by a knife in trying to rescue his daughter, who was just trying to kill herself. And and for someone like Steve, you try to protect the dignity of your child who's been suffering for so many years. And you really don't want to drag their, reputation through the mud. You want to get them help. But then when things go public and that, all of a sudden you don't have that privacy. And one of the things it allows you to do now, since everybody knows, is we can talk more openly, and Steve does. So in that, I greatly commend Steve. And Steve and I have worked together on a lot of these issues because it's affected him. I'm involved because my family's been affected. I'm also involved because I've watched my own parents go through this situation and amazingly watch my parents' marriage survive. And not many people get the opportunity to watch a marriage survive serious mental illness. More than 90% fail. So we've got some things in the news, prominent people who, you're likely to see some divorce proceedings happen. And they might talk about the real elephant in the room, which is the mental health issue. So that's going on. Hey, we haven't had a chance, Eddie and I haven't had a chance to talk about, it was a nice run for the United States in the FIFA World Cup. And they made it, I think, about as far as they should have made it. I was so impressed with the Belgian soccer team that defeated the United States in Seattle. And they just were better players, playing a much better game. I think it was the worst performance I saw by the United States. It might have been the best performance we'll see from Belgium, but they owned the United States that night. They just did. From beginning to end, they just did. So what you see with FIFA is, I think, today now we're doing that, the quarterfinals. And it's largely a European competition. Morocco is in. And let's see, who else? Was it Argentina made it in? I'm trying to think. Men's World Cup, scoreboard schedule, standings bracket. Let's look up bracket. So we got France and Spain. France beat Morocco, so now Africa's out. Belgium got defeated 2-1, so they are out. So France and Spain is in that semifinal. And what's going on today, starting 4 p.m., Norway and England two teams I really like. I guess right now I'm probably more of a Norway fan than anyone. Yeah, and Argentina and Switzerland. So I don't know. I guess I would probably, boy, it's going to be tough. England is very good. Very good. They might have the edge. And Switzerland, Argentina, man, Argentina might make that. If they do, you'll end up with, at best, you can have one South American team. That means one Western Hemisphere team and three European teams. I mean, let's face it, soccer is a European-dominated sport. No doubt about it. And it's incredible. So we got that going on. Other than that, college sports is kind of on a hiatus until, about 6 more weeks. And then we'll be watching, college football taking off, plus preseason professional football. What's going on with wars? Trump went to NATO and by all accounts had a very good meeting with his NATO counterparts. And Turkey hosted it. Turkey being an Islamic nation and increasingly Islamic nation. Evidently, Trump really strove to build inroads with Erdogan. I mean, he's not a nice guy. He's pretty hardliner, and there's a lot of human rights allegations against him. There really are. So I'm uncomfortable with, including them in NATO. But other than that, it seems like Trump, served the world a great service by kind of getting Zelensky from Ukraine to kind of settle down and grow up a little bit. I mean, that famous first Oval Office meeting that just ended in a disaster where Trump blew up at him. Things have really changed. And I think Zelensky just was too big for his own britches and in over his head. So there's that. I don't know what's going to happen with Russia and Ukraine. I don't know if it's going to end anytime soon. And for that matter, what goes on with Iran and the United States, I mean, Trump finally learned his lesson. You cannot negotiate with Iran. In order to negotiate with anybody, you first of all have to believe that they are people of honor, who when they say something, they mean it. Iran is a nation of liars in charge. Okay? I'm not saying that about every Iranian person. I have a good friend, neighbor who's a dissident, and you might say refugee from Iran. He's very proud of his ethnicity, and, fine. Everybody should be able to be proud of their ethnicity. Absolutely. And it doesn't require putting down somebody else's heritage in order to feel good about my heritage. I mean, that's the juvenile part of, somehow in order to be a proud Norwegian, you have to disparage the Swedes. No, but that's gone on for too long. And when I hear somebody running down other ethnicities and at the same time trying to talk about how great their heritage is, I have no respect for them. As you think you got past that when you got out of high school or junior high. People who think that they can build themselves up by putting others down. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I'm hoping that we get something out of there. But here's the thing. We're not really the people who largely suffer the consequences of Iran's bad behavior. As long as, we prevent them from nuclear designs, the people who are most at risk of Iran's bad behavior is China. Because China needs their ships going in and out of the Arabian Gulf I'm not going to call it the Persian Gulf. The Arabian Gulf, they need that oil at market prices so they can compete with the rest of the world. And they don't want some trolls under the bridge saying you can't cross this bridge or go through these straits without paying us $1 million per trip. That ain't going to fly. Those waters are and should be international waters, just as the Straits of Istanbul separate the Mediterranean Sea and the rest of the world from the Black Sea. The Black Sea is a large body of water that is shared by Ukraine, Romania, I believe, is it Bulgaria, Georgia, Russia, of course. Yeah, and all of those nations should have access to it, and merchant ships doing business with any of those nations without being attacked or charged, a fee by any other nation there. I guess if anybody could argue that, we have to police these waters and regulate, safe passage, you could say that Turkey, Istanbul, would have a legitimate claim to say, hey, everybody, stay to the right, pass other ships to the right of them, and single lane file, because, man, you have a tanker, hit a bridge in Istanbul. Oh, my God. That could be disaster. That could clog everything up and be very costly for several nations. So, I don't know what's going to happen there. And quite frankly, I care less and less. And it's good for the United States that our oil is becoming much more attractive on the open market. We're making inroads with South America. I mean, we got rid of, the crazy idiot in Venezuela, arrested him. And the rest of the country said, we don't have much stomach for that kind of talk. We just, we really want to sell our oil and live a better life. And it looks like Trump's working with him on that. Hey, got some good news in Minnesota. Started with bad news. The esteemed idiot, Tim Walz, governor, has a guy there living there for a long time who is a child rapist, convicted. And now, based on that, the Homeland Security says, okay, we got to deport him because he has a criminal record. It violated state law, felony child rape. So Tim Walz says, I'll just pardon him. It'll be like he never raped anybody, even though I think there's multiple counts. So my sisters, my nephews and nieces live throughout Minnesota. My mother, all of them are at risk because there's a rapist on the loose in Minnesota because Tim Walz didn't want him deported, so he let him go free. Well, the way this is set up, this guy came here as a political refugee with asylum because he met the qualifications. This is like 20 years ago. So he got asylum. That's decided by the State Department. Okay. They're the experts in knowing, the politics, between the different nations and stuff. And they're the ones that certify that. So Homeland Security can only deport somebody who's on that list of political refugees if they've committed a felony while residing here. Tim Walz thinks he's really smart. He's going to pardon the guy. Therefore, ICE can't deport him. Well, ICE also can't deport people who are on this political refugee list. And it takes a certification from the State Department that whether a nation fits that criteria. So in comes Marco Rubio. And he says, you know what? That was 20 some years ago or maybe longer. And I think it was it Myanmar or Burma that this guy comes from? And he says, okay, we're now, because of governmental change stuff, we're taking that nation off of that list. Anybody who's here from there can no longer stay here under political asylum. So without that protection, this guy, child rapist, convicted, pardoned by an idiot, Tim Walz, who's anti-American, he gets deported, and it happens swiftly, and he's gone. So this is the problem, though, we have, is we've got many big federal bureaucracies that they have to work together, and getting them to work together is difficult. This got prominent enough. It got attention from Marco Rubio. He got his people in line. He says, let's look at it, and let's reassess and find out, should we keep that in place? Now, keep in mind, we just got done doing that with Haiti. We're saying, no, you cannot get political asylum because you're in Haiti, or you're from Haiti. Not anymore. That was called temporary asylum. That temporary just ended its temporary. So anyway, that's going on. I think we got just about all the news today. I didn't want to just, go AWOL again. So I'm going to call it a wrap. This is David Van, and you've been watching Fresh Black.Coffee. We'll see you again next week. Eddie will be back, and we will talk to you later. All right.